We will live in prosperity. Construction built to spec. Building a Chinese for China. We have big plans. It will look real nice when it's done.
We stand together.
Build orders complete, sir.
We stand together.
Building the Chinese for China. China will grow larger. Let's build.
We stand together.
It will look real nice when it's done.
We stand together.
Build orders complete, sir.
We stand together.
Building the Chinese Empire. Construction.
We stand together.
Complete.
We
China
stand
has been
together.
Generous. There's not enough building
We stand
space.
together.
Building the Chinese we will live in prosperity.
We stand together.
Let's build.
We stand together.
I am unable to build
We
there.
stand together.
We will live in prosperity. Construction built. There's not
stand
enough
together.
build space. China
We
has
stand
been
together.
generous. I am unable to
We
build
stand
there.
together.
Building the
We
Chinese
stand
That's
together.
not a good spot. Try another. We have big plans. Nice location. Building is complete. Building the Chinese Empire.
We stand together. We stand together.
I build
We
for
stand
China.
together. We stand together.
China
Upgrade
will
complete.
grow
We
larger.
stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand
China
together.
has been generous. Build
We
orders
stand
complete,
together.
sir.
Stand together.
I build
We
for
stand
China.
together. We stand together.
Upgrade
We
complete.
stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Build orders complete, sir.
Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Construction
We
with two
stand
spec.
together.
Unit lost.
We stand together.
Upgrade complete.
We stand together.
We are the red bar.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Deposit armor installed,
Unit
sir.
lost.
We stand together. 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 We stand together.
Congratulations, General. You have been
We
promoted.
have big
We
plans.
stand together. We stand
We will
together.
live in prosperity.
We stand together.
Nice location.
We stand together. We stand together.
Yes,
We stand
this
together.
building is ours.
We stand
Defenders of peace.
We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
Stand together. We stand together.
Congratulations, General. You have been promoted.
We stand together.
Let's build. Ah, yes.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together.
Congratulations, General. You have been promoted.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
the building is ours. We have captured the building, sir.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand
Scanning.
together.
VX, all systems
Our
green.
base is being attacked.
China has been
Scanning for enemies.
built for China. China will grow large.
Report.
Build orders complete, sir.
Unit lost. Congratulations, General. You have been promoted.
Scanning for enemies. All set.
We stand together.
Report. On watch.
Unit lost.
Scanning.
Unit lost.
Scanning.
Our base is under attack!
In position. Verticals clean.
China has been... Nice location. I built for China.
We stand together.
China will
We stand
grow larger.
together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Construction disrespect.
Unit lost.
We stand
VX, all systems green. VX, all systems green. In position. Scanning for enemies.
We stand together.
China has been generous.
We stand together.
nice
We stand
location.
together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand
Scanning.
Unit lost.
In position. VX, all systems green. Scanning for enemies.
We stand together. We stand together.
Sending
Unit
attention.
lost.
Right away.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
We will live in prosperity.
We stand together.
We will not
All
get
set.
stuck. We have big plans. China will grow
Report.
Together.
Scanning.
Unit
Report.
lost.
I built for China. That's a good choice.
We
We
stand
will live
together.
in prosperity. Nice location.
We stand together. We stand
Construction
together.
is complete.
We stand together.
Ready for order.
VX, all systems green. Report.
Understood.
Together.
We have big plans.
Unit
Scanning.
lost.
Real nice when it's done.
We stand together.
At last, we win.
We stand together.
They will run in fear.
We stand together. We stand together.
Pathetic.
We stand together.
With pleasure.
Construction is complete. Build. Nice location.
Verticals clean.
We stand together.
All set.
Unit lost.
We stand together.
Scanning. Scanning.
We are the Red Guard.
We stand
Where
together.
are they?
We stand together.
A fine choice.
We stand together.
All set.
We stand together.
Scanning for
The
enemies.
end draws near.
We stand together.
Scanning.
Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together.
I built for China.
Stand
Let's
together.
build. China will
We
grow
stand
large.
together. We stand 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 together.
At last,
We stand together.
In position.
wait. We cannot be stopped.
All set.
Unit lost.
Building is complete.
All
Unit
set.
lost.
We stand
I
together.
have the final say.
We stand together. We stand together.
Verticals clean.
We stand together. 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 We stand together.
Unit lost. Upgrade complete.
We stand together. We stand together.
VX. All systems green.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Scanning.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Scanning for enemies.
Yes.
We stand together.
Unit lost.
We shall end this. Vengeance is near.
Verticals clean.
We are the red guard.
Unit lost.
Scanning for enemies.
We stand together.
Scanning.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Standing attention.
We
Moving
stand
now, sir.
together.
I have the final say. Where are they?
Unit lost.
In position.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
I have the final say.
Upgrade complete.
We wait. We
We
wait.
stand together.
Make a path.
Stand together. We stand
VX.
together.
All systems green.
We shall end
We stand
this.
together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
We stand together.
In position.
We stand together. We stand together.
On watch.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit
We
lost.
stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
The
We
day
stand
has
together.
come. Their end draws
stand
near.
together.
The day has come. Their end draws
We
near.
stand together.
Vertical's clean.
Unit lost.
Scanning.
General, our base is under attack.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand
Unit
together.
lost.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Vertical's clean.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
In position.
Stand together.
Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
VX, all systems green.
I build for
We
China.
stand together. We stand
Unit
together.
lost.
Next location.
Where are
We stand
they?
together. We stand together.
VX, all systems green.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together.
In position.
We stand together. We stand together.
VX, all systems green.
Unit lost.
Build order complete, sir.
We stand together.
In position.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
On
We
watch.
stand together.
All set.
We stand together. 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 We stand together.
Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together.
Build for China.
VX, all systems green.
We stand
Let's
together.
build.
We stand together.
I have the final say.
We stand together.
On watch.
Unit lost.
We wait. Where are they? I have the final say.
In position. BX, all systems green.
China has been generous.
Unit lost.
Let's build. We will not stop.
In position.
Unit lost.
Verticals clean.
Construction is complete.
Verticals clean.
Unit lost.
Verticals clean. Report.
Unit lost.
Standing by.
BX, all systems green. Verticals clean. In position.
China has been generous.
Unit lost.
Twin blade.
Navigation systems ready.
Scanning for enemies.
Unit lost.
There is no mercy.
Standing by.
Unit lost.
BX, all systems green.
We stand
Standing by.
together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Navigation systems ready.
Unit lost.
Verticals clean.
We stand together.
We have big plans. China has big generals.
We stand together.
Navigation systems ready.
Unit lost.
Stand together.
Where are they?
We stand together.
We shall end this.
Standing by.
Stand together.
Unit lost.
Scanning for enemies.
Standing by.
Unit lost.
Vengeance is near.
Navigation systems ready.
On watch. On watch.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
All set. Scanning.
Where are they?
Unit lost.
The day has come. I have the final say. We wait. The day has come. Now.
In position. Scanning.
We cannot be stopped.
Unit
We shall
lost.
end this.
We stand together.
Unit lost.
Stand together. We stand together.
I
We
built
stand
for
together.
China.
VX, all systems green.
We stand together.
Nice location.
We stand together.
Let's
We
build.
stand together.
That's a good
We stand
choice.
together.
Vengeance is near. Their end draws near.
Unit lost.
All set.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
It's complete.
We stand together.
We will give it prosperity.
We stand together.
All set.
Let's build.
We stand together.
Nice location.
We stand together. We stand together.
Verticals clean.
Unit lost.
Together. We stand together.
big
together.
plans.
We
We
stand
will
together.
live in prosperity. It will look
We stand
real nice when
together.
it's done.
Ready for
We
orders.
stand
Understood.
together. Yes,
Report.
we stand together.
Scanning.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Let's build.
Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together.
We shall end this.
VX, all systems green.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
I built for China.
We stand together.
We have
We
big
stand
plans.
together.
Unit
China
All
lost.
set.
will grow larger.
On watch.
We wait.
We stand together. We stand together.
Scanning for enemies. Scanning for enemies.
Together. We stand.
Where are they?
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
On watch.
We stand together.
Building is complete.
On watch. On watch.
Unit lost.
All set.
I built for China. That's none of this stuff.
Unit
Try
lost.
We stand together.
Scanning for enemies. Report.
We stand together. We stand together.
Defenders of peace.
We stand
Moving
together.
now, sir.
We have
We
big
stand
plans.
together.
It will look real nice when it's done.
Unit lost.
We shall end
Construction
this.
is complete.
We stand
Their
together.
end
VX,
draws
all systems
near.
green. Scanning for
There is
enemies.
no
We
mercy.
stand together.
We cannot be stopped. We shall
stand
end
together.
this. I have the final say.
Report.
Vengeance is near. With pleasure.
VX, all systems green.
Where are they? A fine choice. An appetizer.
Unit lost.
There is no mercy. Where are they?
On watch. VX, all systems green.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
VX, all systems green. All set.
I have the final say.
Unit lost.
VX, all systems green. Scanning. In motion.
We shall end this.
In position. Verticals clean.
Unit lost.
Report. In position.
Unit lost.
We stand together.
China has been
We stand
generous.
together. We stand together.
Next location.
I have the final
We
say.
stand together. We stand together.
Verticals clean. Enemies.
We stand together. We stand together.
VX, all systems green.
We stand together. 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 We stand together.
VX, all systems green. Scanning.
Our base is being attacked.
Unit lost. Our power is low.
We will live in prosperity.
We stand together. We stand together.
China has been generous. It will look real
Pending
nice.
attention.
when it's done.
Stand together.
Building the Chinese empire.
Their end draws near.
We
We
stand
will live
together.
in prosperity.
We stand together.
In position.
We stand together.
All set.
We stand together.
Building
stand
is
together.
complete.
Stand together. We
Unit
stand
lost.
together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Construction is complete.
We stand together.
Verticals clean. Got it covered.
Together.
On watch.
We stand together.
Report.
Let's build.
We stand together.
I am unable to build there.
We stand together. We stand together.
Construction
All
built
set.
to spec.
Got it covered. On watch.
We stand together.
The day has come.
We stand together.
Unit lost.
VX, all systems green.
We stand together. We stand together.
Scanning
We
for
shall
enemies.
end this.
We stand together. We stand together.
Their end draws
We
near.
stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
Scanning. Report.
We wait. Vengeance is near.
Scanning.
Standing by. Rudder set for new heading. Attacking.
Scanning for enemies.
Nosferatu, ready. Nosferatu, ready.
In position.
Play with immortality. Yes. Yes.
All set.
They hide from me. Nosferatu, ready to serve. God. Play with
Verticals clean.
Rudder set for new heading. Rudder set for new heading. Navigation systems ready.
Verticals
Rudder
clean.
set for new heading.
Pride of East Air Force. Yes. Fear me. Yes. Steady. Steady. Yes. Play with immortality.
We are victorious.